Last year, I was traveling through the north of Colombia. We were invited as part of the artist collective I worked for to host workshops at a conference on tropical biology. And to that end, we were traveling through the north of Colombia to look for interesting people, places, and initiatives that were innovating the local food system. One night, we stayed at an eco-lodge on the edge of the Tayrona National Park. And in the morning, I had a coffee with our host. I was telling him about the current frenzy in research on agroforestry in the Netherlands and the emergence of countless food forests across the country. He looked at me with a frown and said, "I never heard of the word agroforestry before, and nobody here calls it that, but I think that what you're describing is what my neighbor does. Would you like to meet him?" Did I? So there we went on a little walk through the jungle, 30 minutes through monocultural fields, mostly cattle grazing. And as we entered the land of this farmer, an edible forest, practically indistinguishable from the jungle, we realized, how do you find an 85-year-old, nearly deaf farmer in the middle of heavy foliage? You call him by his name. And his name was Madrid. So there I found myself calling Madrid in the Colombian jungle. After a while, we started to feel like intruders on Madrid's land, and we started feeling a bit uncomfortable. But I had set my mind on meeting this farmer, so we stuck around. After about 30 minutes, when we were about to give up the slope comes walking Madrid, carrying a heavy bag of plantains over his shoulder. I was fortunate enough to spend 2.5 hours with Madrid. Madrid had been working his 2.5 hectares of land since he was 15 years old, 70 years of cultivation. He was growing cacao mostly, papaya, and many other crops in a food forest system. He told us, "I know 263 secrets of cacao cultivation, and I'll tell you 3. As Madrid was nearly deaf, he chose exactly what he wanted to tell you. Asking questions was almost, didn't make much sense. He showed us how to sow cacao seeds and how to determine which part of the seed is suitable and will give a good crop according to the hand feel of the seed. He drew the grid of his design of his food forest in the sand with his machete, explaining that each tree needs to be distanced from the other trees in a particular way to allow for a proper light and shadow and nutrient exchange. Madrid's land was for sale. Since he was 85 years old, he was getting too old to work the land. His children were asking him, "Come live with us, Dad, in our comfortable homes in the town." But Madrid told us it was very hard to leave his life's work behind. After 2.5 hours, we left with a strong sense of urgency. What could happen to Madrid's land if it were sold to land speculators or to farmers who would turn it into an oil palm plantation or a cattle grazing site? We decided to find a way to secure Madrid's land and to somehow buy it. However, merely weeks after I met Madrid and after I'd returned to the Netherlands, he passed away. And this taught me a valuable lesson. Traditional knowledge on food cultivation and preparation and preservation is very volatile and can vanish in a second. His land was sold to land speculators from North America, who will probably sell the land a few years from now for a profit and are most probably currently unaware of the treasure that they have in their possession. Madrid took his 263 minus 3 secrets of cacao cultivation to his grave. Now, I've worked in kitchens since I was 16 years old. I still remember very vividly my first day. I was stood at the entrance of the kitchen, watching the chefs moving in concert together, fluently around each other, never bumping into each other, and it intimidated me. This stopped as soon as I entered the kitchen. Everybody kept bumping into each other. The whole day, people were grabbing next to their pots and pans, clumsily dropping things, and bumping into each other. In the years that followed, I worked in many different kitchens, and I realized that this is a recurring phenomenon. When a new person enters a kitchen team, everybody becomes clumsy. But after a couple of days, or sometimes weeks, we learn how to move together, how to anticipate each other's moves, like a flock of birds or a murmuration of starlings. Today, when I look at a kitchen, I see a space of choreography. It's like a dance floor in which knowing when to accelerate and when to slow down at the right moment is crucial, especially with all the knives and the fire involved. However, this choreography is not just a group choreography, it's also an individual choreography. Cooking is a lot about movements, gestures, rhythm, and balance. Think of the rhythm of a mortar and pestle as you make a fresh basil pesto. Think of the very refined motorical skills that you need to make a good dough of bread. Or even think of the balance of a bottle of wine as you pour the liquid and it shifts, the weight shifts in your hand, and you hear the sound of the liquid in the glass. Without looking, any good waiter will know when he has poured enough into the glass. Now, I was fortunate enough to work with chefs from an immigrant background in Amsterdam for a couple of years. There were many days, rainy days mostly in Amsterdam, in our glasshouse kitchen, where I spent afternoons with groups of women who were rolling flatbreads with a speed and an ease that reminded me of a virtuoso musician. But when I asked them for the recipe, they would often smile at me kindly but warily, shrug, and tell me to watch them instead. When you think about it, recipes are very often hard to give. It's like trying to explain to someone how to ride a bicycle. You can't really. It's hard to put some things into words, but our bodies will know. I started to realize that food knowledge is very much body knowledge. It is stored in our sensory memories and in our embodied practices that we share together. The author Michael Pollan came up with a nice term for this, manual flavor. So it's the idea that you can whip egg whites and with your eyes closed basically, and merely from the resistance of the whisk with the egg whites, your hand will know when they've reached the proper consistency. So this begs the question, if knowledge lives in our bodies, then how do we pass it on? Well, historically, this knowledge was passed down intergenerationally, mostly along the female line. One of the women I love to cook with, Josta, she is a Surinamese woman in her 60s, and she always brought a hammer to our cooking sessions, with which she would smash her ginger and garlic. But when I asked her how much of each spice she added to the pickle liquid to make her famous cucumber pickles, she told me, "Girl, I don't use metrics, I use my body. I lift my grandchildren on my hip from a very early age. I hand them the spice jar. I ask them to shake it into the pot. And when they've added enough, I tell them to stop. This way their hands will remember." However, there is a chink in the intergenerational chain. It has been interrupted. Like Madrid's children, who instead of going to him to learn from his ways and live with him on his land, were asking him to move towards them in the town. It's funny because as a chef, people often ask me, "Did your mother teach you how to cook?" But it's ironic that, and I asked my mom for permission to use this anecdote, that I think I learned precisely how to cook because my mom cannot cook. Sometimes in my dreams, the 25-minute boiled cauliflower that I could eat with a straw still haunts me a bit. Whereas my grandmother still knew how to ferment her own vegetables, how to care for plants, and how to prepare a nourishing meal for her family, my mother has been kept largely in the dark when it comes to cultivating, preserving, and preparing food. From the 1950s onwards, we've witnessed an explosive growth of supermarkets, processed foods, and the general commercialization of our food system. So my mother is not the only one. In today's world, we've become very much alienated from our food, where it comes from, who grows it. If you think about it, the average amount of distance that a food product travels lies between 2,500 and 4,000 kilometers. So imagine the epic journey of the banana that you had for breakfast, the spaces it's been to. We've not only become alienated from our food, but also from each other and from our bodies. We're very much stuck in our minds. Now, it's not to worry, it's not too late. I'm not here to tell Helen doom. There are still experts, there are still knowledge holders that are alive and that hold this traditional knowledge, like Madrid. However, like Madrid passed away, unfortunately, we are currently witnessing a global generation gap in agricultural populations. The average age of a farmer worldwide is about 60 years old. And in the United States, 10% of farmers is even over the age of 70. This means that in the next few decades, young generations are going to have to take over. We're witnessing this major shift. However, young generations, my generation, focuses on non-human intelligence and technological fixes. Now, I believe that it's very important that technological innovation is rooted in old knowledge, because there is a crucial difference between information and knowledge. These non-human intelligence systems, they work with information, but this information is virtually meaningless if it's not rooted in embodied practices. Whereas information is rooted in literacy and in words. From the story I've told you, we've seen that a lot of the knowledge can actually not even be put into words, like the women who would shrug and smile at me. I cannot give you a recipe. You have to watch me, you have to do it. Without embodied practices and our sensory memories, information can turn into a golem. So now the big question is, how do we keep this knowledge alive? How can we restore the intergenerational chain? As a sociologist, I'm a food sociologist trained here in Wageningen. I learned to demarcate my study object and to specialize and to narrow it down in order to study it properly. As scientists, we have a tendency to specialize. We know everything about a very specific topic, which then actually kind of prevents us from talking to anyone outside of our discipline who doesn't also know everything about that particular topic. Therefore, I decided I would never want to become an armchair scientist. It's very crucial for me to be immersed in unfamiliar spaces on a regular basis to stay humble. So apart from working in kitchens since age 16, I've also worked at supermarkets, stacking shelves. I've worked at an organic market selling vegetables. I work at farms where I help with the harvest. And actually working at farms showed me that this choreography that's so important in the kitchen, it's also important in agriculture. Think of the movement of harvesting a pear and knowing how to twist it so that it breaks at its natural breaking point. Think of the gestures in scattering seeds across a field. Think of the motorical skills needed for pruning, planting, sowing, harvesting, weeding, and so on and so forth. I've also worked with artist collectives, doing installations and theater performances with food. And here I got the idea to adopt methods from choreography of dance to the realm of food. What if we look at a field or a kitchen as a dance floor with a choreography mapped out? What if we look at our body and how we move through an agricultural field or a kitchen as a choreography? One of my good friends, Fernanda, she's an ethnochoreologist, which is an anthropologist of movement and a dancer. And she told me about this method for transcribing movement. So like you can write down sounds and write music, you can also write down movements. So over the next years, I will be working on adapting these methodologies and developing them in order to hopefully find a way to capture and archive some of the knowledge that still remains. Working in all these different disciplines has taught me a funny paradox. That as scientists, we try to get deeper into a topic, but sometimes it's necessary to zoom out in order to see the interconnected relationships that were until then hidden from your view. We should not lose sight of this embodied knowledge. I think it's our responsibility to restore the intergenerational chain. I went all the way to Colombia to find Madrid, who passed away shortly after I met him. But merely weeks after Madrid passed away, my own grandmother passed away as well. And she was my last remaining grandparent. So we don't have to go all the way to the other side of the world. We can look around us and spend time with the people, with our elders that still hold crucial knowledge. This knowledge can be vital in the light of accelerating climate change because it helps us to retain agency over our food provisioning, resilience and self-sufficiency for where our food comes from and how it is grown. Thank you very much.